I go outside and early. Sounds weird. Yeah, but this next week. Right. I just knew last night, so I just. No, I'm gonna invite this to the office.
Beef bench.
I'm an overpowered leaf blower. Right out of comments, it's gonna really blow your budget.
Yeah. I see, I know, first of all.
I'm not sure.
It's a lot of, are you talking to me?
Yeah, I mean, I got a YouTube video on, hold on. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, I can hear you better.
Okay. If I didn't, you can't, just let me know.
Okay. Yeah, I think once it's just you talking, I'll be good.
Yeah. There's some background chatter, but, it's about 5 minutes. I'm glad you're not doing for it. How you doing?
I just finished teaching, so I left that class. Now I'm here. I have a gala tonight, so it's good though. It's a very black day. We're celebrating the last, couple hours of Black History Month, so.
Yeah. I hear you. You got 5 minutes to decompress if you need it. So.
Say it again.
You got 5 minutes to decompress if you need it.
Okay, I'm gonna do that. But I'll still be here.
Start. All right. So, sessions of this African American Philosophy Open Classroom for Black History Month. Let me just make a quick aside that I am humbled that so many of you all have come out. The last time I looked at the numbers outside of my 11 students, I think we've reached like 200 people. So this is an amazing. It exceeded my wildest expectations for us, so thank y'all so much for coming. Thank you to the classes, the whole classes that are here today. I really appreciate you all. My name is Dr. Corey Reed, and for accessibility purposes, I'm a Black man with a black and gold African print shirt on, black jeans, and some tan shoes. And I'm an assistant professor of philosophy here at Butler, a steering committee member of the Race, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program, as well as one of the 3 co-directors for the Hub for Black Affairs and Community Engagement. I want to thank the Philosophy Department, Philosophy and Religious Studies Department, the Race, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program, Butler's DEI department, Liberal Arts and Sciences, and the Black and African Studies minor for their support for this endeavor. Today's format will start with a brief introduction to the topic, which I'll do, a 20-minute or so presentation by our wonderful guest speaker, a few preset questions for our guest speaker, and then there'll be an open Q&A. Priority will first go to the students who are enrolled in my class, and then we'll open it up to both the room and anyone on Zoom who wants to ask questions in the question box. For other students, BCR credit is only available for those who are in person, and that QR code will be available at the end of the session. Being Black in the United States is a perpetual paradoxical condition. In his debate with William F. Buckley in 1965, James Baldwin states the following, quote, "It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover the flag you pledge your allegiance to, along with anyone else, does not pledge allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country which is your birthplace, to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality, has not evolved a place for you," end quote. Toni Morrison, in her short piece called Home, not to be confused with the novel called Home, says the following, quote, "The relocation of peoples has ignited and disrupted the idea of home and expanded the focus of identity beyond definitions of citizenships and clarifications of foreignness. Who is the foreigner? Is a question that leads us to the perception of an implicit and heightened threat within difference. We see it as the defense of the local against the outsider, personal discomfort with one's sense of belonging. Am I the foreigner in my own home? Is the question she asks. Of unwanted intimacy instead of safe distance, end quote. Baldwin and Morrison, famous for giving us both fiction and nonfiction accounts of the Black experience between the 1960s and 1980s, of course, further for Toni Morrison, but James Baldwin dies in the 80s, articulates the problem of Black being that does not neatly fit into the designations of integration or separation. Instead, they give us accounts of living in paradox and internal conflict, knowing only America as their home, and yet being considered the stranger, the foreigner, or the other in the land their ancestors and elders built. The feeling of estrangement in the land of our ancestors' buried bones. The philosophical value of the second verse of the Black National Anthem becomes more apparent when thought through Baldwin and Morrison. It goes as follows. "Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn has died. Yet with a steady beat have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed. We have come over a way where tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out from the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. Estrangement is an internal psychological battle as much as it is an external political fight for the world. Argument tells us that, quote, if there is one thing we can learn from the 60s, it is how indefinitely complex the move for liberation must be. But we must move against not only those forces which dehumanize us from the outside, but also against those oppressive values which we have been forced to take into ourselves, end quote. The philosophical journey, therefore, is not only about resilience to continue in the face of external adversity, but the constant internal cleansing to ensure that we do not replicate the very oppressions we are experiencing. Existentialism, phenomenology, and psychoanalysis have all been used, all have been methods for engaging this Black conundrum, to constantly reaffirm a different reality than one we experience, to constantly tell ourselves that we are not what the world says we are, and above all, to not become the oppressor in the search for liberation. So when Cornel West describes the 4 types of responses that African Americans engage in, the exceptionalist, the assimilationist, the marginalist, and the humanist, the question behind them all is a question about Black place and space in America. What tactic is best for us to survive anti-Blackness in the world? Do we engage in exceptionalism in an attempt to distance ourselves from the imposed ascriptions of others, taking a constant defensive stance by making Blackness less threatening? Do we take on an assimilationist approach in an attempt to hide in plain sight and become as close to white America as we can for the few benefits that it yields? Do we embrace what means to be marginal and focus our energies on revolts and finding power and creativity for what makes us marginal? Or do we take up the humanist approach, which is the confrontation with the lie of Black inferiority, anchored in the unquestionable humanity of Black subjects? Baldwin, Morrison, Lord, and West all engaged the questions of Black identity in the post-soul generation after the 1960s. These are questions we are still answering today regarding what we ought to do, and have for Blackness to feel greater autonomy and agency in America. The conundrum of illogical strangerhood is one that many African Americans experience at some time in their lifetime. To feel foreign in the place you invest in, help maintain, or should have authority in. From college campuses to corporations, from suburbs to small towns, from religious to political parties. The question at hand, following Du Bois's notion, is how does it feel to be a stranger in your own home? This is largely an epistemic question about self-knowledge and the knowledge of the world around the agent. And there is perhaps no better epistemologist and Black feminist thinker to tackle this issue than Dr. Kay Bailey Thomas. Dr. Thomas is the founder and director of the annual Roundtable for Black Feminist and Womanist Theory. They have published work on intersectionality, transnationalism, misogyny law, epistemic ignorance, and more. Beyond that, Dr. Thomas is a dear friend and colleague in the field of philosophy and Black studies. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kay Bailey Thomas.
Thank you, Corey. That was a fantastic introduction and also a fantastic introduction to the topic for today. And I'm really happy that you cited that passage from Du Bois because that's actually where I'm going to be beginning today. So before I get started, I want to just echo the previous speakers, thanking you, Corey, for organizing this wonderful event. We really need spaces like this now more than ever. And the fact that you also made it accessible for folks to participate virtually is extremely important. And I hope that for the students in the classroom, I can't see you all, but I'm there with you in spirit. I hope that you really take this time to appreciate the immense privilege that you have, not just to be in the space where you are, but to have an instructor such as Dr. Reed, who is relentless in his pursuit to teach authentically and teach honestly. And part of what I'm going to be talking about today is rooted in this overall concern about not just being a stranger in one's own home, but part of what I think is really the question we want to be asking, which is what are we doing or what should we be doing about the censorship of Black thought? So most of my work is centered around aspects of social epistemology. So how is it that we know in groups? In particular, in my research, I'm concerned with the suppression of knowledge and the way that ignorance functions both as a political tool and a means of weaponization against marginalized communities. So just to also, for context, I am going to, talk with you all. I don't have slides or anything like that. It's a bit hard to do all of that, especially when I'm not in person with you all. So I hope that you'll indulge me for the next, 15 minutes or so and allow me to explain a bit of, how I'm thinking about this question of being a stranger in one's own home and how I think this discussion that has been had throughout the last couple of talks relates to our current, political, our current political times and our current standpoint. So before we even talk about Du Bois and what he means about being a stranger in one's own home, I want to sort of bring us back to a further question he asks, or a further statement he makes, really, when he says, one ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. So this is one of the early parts of Souls of Black Folks, the very first chapter titled Our Spiritual Strivings. And this is where Du Bois is trying to explain to his audience, or his gentle reader, as he refers to them, primarily white America, right? About what does it mean to be Black? And he also notes that no one ever asks him that question outright. They don't ever say it. They will say, oh, I know a good colored man up in this other area. Or even today's context, they'll say, I heard about George Floyd and it was just awful what happened. And so part of what is also being illustrated here are the ways in which language is being used to really mask the questions that we should be asking, partly because, not that we don't know how to ask them, we do. I'm going to argue that we're really afraid of the answer that we're going to get. And so in another part of Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois asks the haunting question, which was already presented to you, but I'll pose it again. Why am I a stranger in my own house? That question, posed over a century ago, is still with us. It echoes in banned books. It lingers in laws against teaching Black history, and Black history just being one of many sub-areas of ethnic studies. I'm not sure what you've discussed in your class so far, other classes, but other areas, for example, Chicana studies have long been politicized and banned in many southwestern states as well, notably Arizona. And so these laws against teaching Black history, they're reverberating in recent waves of executive orders that cancel events such as this based on identity. And so this moment that we are living in, this suppression of Black intellectual thought, the rewriting of history, the outright erasure of Black contributions to the very fabric of this country, it is not new. It might seem that way, and especially with the industrialization of society and the advancements that we have, particularly with social media, we're able to share more content and also share explicit documents. For example, for my fellow professors in the room, the Dear Colleagues letter that we got, most notably on Valentine's Day, which they love us so much, right? And this notion of restricting not just what we're teaching in the classrooms, but even restricting what we're even allowed to know about and acknowledge at every facet of life, not just in this college classroom, even at the primary and secondary level, in public spaces, in areas of employment. None of this is new. We have been here before, and we will keep returning to this moment until we finally answer Du Bois's question, not with a form of resignation, but with a particular truth. And that's what I'm here to talk with you about today. So what I'm hoping to do in the next couple of minutes that I have is to really examine, what does it mean to be Black in America, especially when these intellectual traditions are under attack. We're going to confront the fact that white supremacy is not creative. It never has been. It simply recycles the same tactics under different names. And what we will ask, or what I'm going to push us to ask, is what does it mean to belong in a country that was built on Black labor, Black thought, Black resistance, Native and Indigenous genocide, enforced removal of lands, abstraction of resources, yet continues to treat us, all of us, as strangers. So let's be clear, the suppression of Black thought is not a side effect of racism. This is not a side effect of a particular position or a particular administration. The suppression of Black thought is the point of racism. The goal has always been to control the narrative, to dictate how Blackness is perceived, who is allowed to speak, and what truths are deemed acceptable. And this even means controlling the narrative around who is even considered to be Black and why. So here, think back to the numerous debates throughout both of former President Obama's presidential terms, when they debated the legitimacy of his birth certificate and the legitimacy of his Blackness. Was he Black enough because he still had a white mother while having a Kenyan father? So Morrison warns us about the repetition of history and white supremacy's lack of creativity. In The Origin of Others, she explains how fear is manufactured intentionally to create an other. And this other, with a capital O, is a group of people who could be scapegoated, blamed, and dehumanized. And the most important thing to remember about the process of othering is that the ultimate goal of othering doesn't just stop at dehumanization. It stops at death. The fear of the other that is inscribed in order to not just prevent coalition building, but also to, again, to shift our attention away from societal issues and put them upon a particular community or group. First, right, the first step is always going to be instituting this us versus them mentality. Then we're leading into fear of the other. So not just a hatred, right? The hatred is there too, but the hatred is rooted in this fear. It's rooted within, pseudo fears. For example, these people are taking our jobs. How many times have we heard that? But more importantly, I'm going to say it's rooted in a fear, as Baldwin illuminates, which is that there really isn't much to a white American identity that is not based on the negation of non-white people. So James Baldwin famously writes in The Fire Next Time that for the white man, the Black man is a fixed star in which his attention is constantly focused on. So we really need to think critically about the meaning of an identity or supposed identity that is only predicated based on what X group is not, right? So from that fear ultimately leads to the desire, or really the necessity, to kill the other. It's never going to be enough to build a wall. It's never going to be enough to cancel classes. It's never going to be enough to deny people tenure or to shutter HBCUs. The overall goal of othering, or the result of othering, is always going to be death. And we've seen that already. For some of you, maybe it was more apparent during the summer of 2020. For others, like myself, maybe it became more prominent in 2012 with the murder of Trayvon Martin, or maybe in 2015 with the murder of Mike Brown. But othering has been going on for decades centuries, and it's not new. It's just new maybe in terms of how it's being felt. So we really have to think about whether or not these book bans, attacks on Black studies, and these laws against identity-based events, are these really new ideas? And they're not. Part of the Blue Book of Fascism that Morrison writes essentially argues this fact that the same playbook of white supremacy has been used for generations. We can trace this back all the way to Reconstruction and the Redemption era. Many of these sentiments, which Du Bois also spoke about in his very large text titled Black Reconstruction, has to do with the fact that in the 1890s, you know, when we see Reconstruction being dismantled, being deemed a failure, and it's a failure because of Black people. They did not know how to be free. They did not deserve to be free. And those free Blacks who were then brought into Congress, many of them as representatives, were then chased out due to the idea, right, that they were not able to comport themselves correctly. They were corrupt. And so the way that the United States, in particular the South, is able to explain away this failure of Reconstruction is by placing it on the backs of Black Americans. So the dismantling of Reconstruction, we are also seeing, of course, the rise of Jim Crow, Black literacy again being criminalized in parts of the South. In the 1950s and 60s, Black radical intellectuals, Angela Davis, Paul Robeson, James Baldwin, and even Audre Lorde, all surveilled, exiled, and branded as dangerous. Many people don't realize it, but the FBI actually has a file on Audre Lorde. And out of many Black radicals, she's probably the least likely that you would think to actually have been surveyed, but they did in fact follow her and have various agents actually pose as undergraduate students, especially when she went to Mexico for a brief period of time due to her desire to really get away from the McCarthyism that was happening in the United States at the time, and because of the fact that she did have many communist friends, even though she herself, she would say that she wasn't exactly a communist, but certainly sympathetic to some of their ideals. The 1990s, Morrison's Beloved already being challenged in school curricula, right? So that's the original banned book list. And today, in 2025, the same strategies are being deployed under different names: anti-wokeness, parental rights, canceling identity politics, anti-discriminatory identity theory, whatever it is that we want to term it. It's not new. And it's not about protecting students. It's not about promoting free thought, because if it was, you all would be reading it. It's about fear. So let's dig a little bit deeper and think about what this fear is actually rooted in. Is it the fear of Black knowledge? Is it fear of Black liberation? As Public Enemy, you know, have famously in their album title, is it a fear of a Black planet? Or is it the fear of losing the illusion of white supremacy? And I'm going to take this moment to also be sure that I'm you know, intentionally cognizant of the fact that this fear of losing the illusion of white supremacy is not something that is only held to white people, to racially white people. There are many non-white people, Black folks included, who are holding on very strongly to their proximity to whiteness. And I'm not just talking about, you know, individuals like Clarence Thomas, right? There are many folks, even some of my fellow academics, right, who are very, very enticed by the illusionary promises of whiteness. And so Cornel West calls this fear of losing the illusion of white supremacy the great contradiction of American democracy. So the United States claims to be this beacon of freedom, yet it requires the subjugation of Black people to function. It claims to be a land where all are welcomed, where everyone can be the best possible person they can be, yet it sustains itself on the denial of Native and Indigenous land, the 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 denial of the history of this forced removal, the denial of the history of the way in which enslaved individuals literally built this country to the very Capitol, including the White House twice. Remember, it was burned down once. And yet we still have this constant contradiction that is occurring and is very much so central to American life. And so Audre Lorde puts it a little bit more plainly when she says, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And now this is a phrase of Lorde's that is thrown around a lot, especially in activist spaces. And as a Lordean scholar, I am very particular about how I, invoke this. And I want to be clear that Lorde is not saying the master's tools are not useful or they can't do anything. So liberal approaches to racial justice, diversity initiatives, representation politics, incremental reform. So again, to my fellow academics, right, whenever you bring up an issue, the first thing is a committee. The committee is always established and it gets a charge and, we all know how that goes. So those might be useful, but Lorde is saying that they're never going to dismantle the master's house. These tools of liberalism are never going to actually dismantle oppressive systems. They might help us to resist, they might help us to survive, and that's what we really need to do at the end of the day, is to survive. But it's never going to actually bring about racial justice. They're not designed to do so. They're designed to contain it. So when we take, for example, this push for racial dialogue, right, especially with the various, the campus unrest around students who are advocating for the representation of Palestinian identities and students and histories in the current struggle against recognizing the sovereignty of Palestinian people and the history of whiteness and colonialism that has led us to this moment with the struggle against Israeli history and identity, the United States intervention. Many of these calls for racial dialogue or community dialogue occur, but they occur without accountability. They occur without results that really push us towards any form of restorative justice. Another example is the belief that the more Black elected officials we have, or the next Black president we have, will lead to the absolvement of structural racism. When history shows us, in fact, time and time again, and this is part of what Audre Lorde means when she's saying that we have not learned from the 60s. We have not learned that the system itself is the problem. It doesn't matter if we put the face of a woman on it, or we put the face of a Black man, or we even put the face of a Black queer or trans person. The system itself is always going to be the problem. And the illusion of liberalism is the fact that it persuades us to think that certain diversity initiatives are putting more diverse people in power or adding diverse perspectives, however they're going to word it. The illusion is that by adding a little bit of DEI, we'll be creating this stronger, better future or beloved community for many people who are, citing Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But again, the system itself is the problem. And this is what we call racialism in African American philosophy. It's the view and belief that race is real and meaningful, and especially for those who take a racial realist approach, such as from Derek Bell, we say that it's real in the sense that there are real consequences for individuals who are racialized in society. And this includes white people, even though they don't think of themselves as racialized. So while it might be a social construction, that doesn't mean that it's not real, and it doesn't mean that there aren't consequences. But the critique of racialism, especially for Black intellectuals, is because racialism is often used to promote assimilation as opposed to liberation. And assimilation will never grant us true belonging, because belonging requires justice, and justice requires transformational change that is radical in its very sense. So we're no longer requesting a seat at the table. We're flipping those very tables. We're destroying those rooms and structures where the table is taking place, where these meetings are, because I don't want a seat in a liberalist structure that is only going to continue to mask the oppression of myself and those in my community with the guise of perhaps, giving me some sort of compensation for helping them to continue the liberal project, which ultimately still is pushing for the subjugation of Black people. So that being said, we have to think about, what does radical transformation look like? And Morrison, I think, told us best when she writes that it begins with language. And so she says, we die. That might be the meaning of life, but we do language. That may be the measure of our lives. Morrison's warning is clear. If we allow white supremacy to dictate our language, what we can read, what we can teach, what we can discuss, we will lose more than just our history. We lose our future. The Black intellectuals that you all have read for this open classroom series, and for those of you in Dr. Reed's class for the remainder of your semester, these individuals are central to the intellectual heritage that is important, not just as my work as a scholar, but in my ability to understand myself. We must refuse to be afraid of our own histories. Everyone has a history in this project that is now the United States. We can't continue to ask permission to exist, to theorize, and to create. We have to be willing to build something beyond the confines of what white America allows us to imagine. And there are many reasons why people are fearful of taking this approach. And one of the main concerns is because it's going to demand a lot of us. And for my fellow academics, there is the fear, right? If you push too much, you talk too much, too loudly, then you lose your security. You don't get tenure. Maybe you're fired. Maybe you're shifted around to a new department. There are many ways that this happens. But the demand of radicality, and it is a demand, requires that we take that chance. We have to. If we want to believe that there is a future where racial justice will actually be realized, we have to take that chance. We have to force ourselves to imagine beyond the limits that we've been told exist. And certain folks, especially, maybe for some fellow Afro-pessimists who might be on this call, right? There's always the question of, well, is there even a possibility for such a, a future to exist? I'm not an Afro-pessimist. I'm Afro-curious. I'm curious about the position. I'm not really taking a stake one way or another. But when we talk about the end of the world, I'm going to push us to think that if we were to take the position of our ancestors, this is the end of the world. This is the worst reality that could exist. So what really are we losing by putting it all on the line? As Audre Lorde says, what are we losing by speaking up? Remaining in silence is an option, but it's ultimately going to kill us. So how much of an option is that? So let's return back to where we started. Why am I a stranger in my own home? I'm going to propose that we answer Du Bois a little bit differently this time. We are not strangers. This house, America, is not some benevolent gift to us. It was built on us. As Malcolm X famously said in his Ballad of the Bullet speech, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. That's a real statement. That's not just something that, you know, Denzel Washington added, if you all have seen the Spike Lee movie. But it is our labor that made this wealth. It's our intellect that has shaped institutions, our culture that drives global influence, and Black culture is very lucrative. We've certainly seen that. So no, we are not strangers here. We are the architects. And if we are the architects, then we do not have to accept the walls that they built. We can dismantle them. We can reimagine this house. And if necessary, we can burn it down and start anew. That is the power of Black intellectual thought. That is why they fear it, and that is why they ban it. And that is why we must never stop creating it. Thank you.
Oh, no. So I got a couple of questions for you, Bailey, and then I'll release it to my students. The first thing I want to ask you is, I feel like all of these authors and thinkers were really prophetic, and we could have wrote these words like yesterday, and they would have the same valence. I wanted to ask you, what would you say are the most relevant things that we can still carry from some of these thinkers here in 2025?
That's a really good question. I think the most important thing that we still carry with us is this denial of some sort of new legitimacy that white supremacy has, or the denial of this idea, which I understand why people have it, but still the perpetuation of this idea that whatever you know, the administration is up to is something new and is something that is a completely new danger that we've never been exposed to. And part of that, I think, is built with it's built in this desire to push us to constantly remember that in various cases, and universities are doing this, mine included, you know, we're already bending to the will of these people preemptively. And the truth of Black radical history is always the idea that we have to stop seeking validation from institutions and communities that just were never built for us. So I myself, you know, when I think about my role here at University of Rhode Island or wherever I'm at, you know, I am occupying that space. I am an outsider because it wasn't meant for me. But that doesn't mean that I'm an outsider in terms of being a valid knower. It doesn't mean that I'm an outsider in understanding how history works. And it also means that I'm not going to believe that history is going to bend towards justice without a fight. So this passive idea of believing that, you know, we just have to wait it out, or we have to wait until we get to XYZ point, or for so-and-so to come into power, that's, I think, part of the sentiment that is really important, that rings true with today. Justice will never be achieved without a fight. And the fight doesn't mean necessarily that we have to, you know, go out pitchfork swinging. There is going to be violence, and the violence isn't always physical. We're in a state of epistemic violence right now, which in many ways is just as harmful as physical violence. So the suppression of Black thought depends on our compliance, on us believing that we have to ask to be here, and we don't, and we never did. So I think the real question is, what are we willing to risk to create something different? And that's where I see us picking up from the previous folks who have, you know, been influential in this work.
Awesome, awesome. So my second question for you is, how do we navigate this paradox, right? This same sort of war that we have from Du Bois forward, the complicated nature of being essentially American, while also, outside of the centrality of America, right? How do we wrestle with that and find some sort of synthesis between it?
So I think again, that's indicative of us really asking the wrong question. So when Du Bois talks about, when he first introduces this concept of double consciousness, when he's asking this question of what is it like to be Black in America? How do we reconcile these seemingly warring ideals? It's also important to consider what Du Bois comes to in 1920 with Darkwater. There he has a chapter titled The Souls of White Folk, which if you haven't read, you have to. It is the best drag that I have ever seen from a scholar of that century. Think of like the Drake and Kendrick Lamar feud, but in words and being, from the mid-19th century. But anyway, for those who aren't familiar with that discussion, Du Bois acknowledges that really he was asking the wrong question. The so-called Negro problem, which is precisely based on how we reconcile these two identities, is not a Black problem. It's a white problem. And ultimately, this is not something that Black people are ever going to answer. And I don't think it's something that we need to answer because as we've established, or at least how I hope I've established, the overall concerns about how we reconcile ourselves and our culture and our community is not really built on concerns that we have. It's built around the treatment and ideas of what it means to be an American coming from a very particular group of people who, as Baldwin argues, don't really have an identity of their own. Their identity is always based on saying that they're not like us, that they don't even know who we are. So how are they going to ever have any hope of understanding themselves? And this history that's being denied that fuels this, this erroneous question of how to reconcile being Black and American is ultimately based on the fact, as Baldwin also says, white people are trapped in a history that they don't understand. And it's not just that they don't understand it, they don't want to understand it. And so as long as that occurs, we're still going to have, again, this erroneous question of how to reconcile both identities. But as we've already seen, many aspects of what it means to be an American, they're rooted in Black culture. Black people have already answered this question. They've already placed their stake on it. To be Black means that you're not African anymore. And that doesn't mean that there's not a connection to the diaspora, but from the moment that the first slave ship landed on what's now the United States, that's where we see this creation of a new Black identity.
Dr. Thomas, can you hear me?
It's a little muffled.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Is it working better at all?
Yeah.
I'm Bella. I'm one of Dr. Reed's students. So one of the things I was thinking about while you were talking about this kind of paradox of identity between being African and being American at the same time, just kind of open-endedly, how do you think the idea of Pan-Africanism works into that identity and into this space, or if it does at all, and if that's like a solution to the problem, or if it would kind of just continue to add to it, if that makes sense?
That's a really good question. So Pan-Africanism, I suppose I should say that it's not the same thing as Black nationalism. They're sometimes used synonymously, but Pan-Africanism is useful here because it, one, reminds us of the rich history of the diaspora. For example, when we think about, when Black Americans might be thinking about how to reconcile this identity of being Black and American, it may seem like a very lonely endeavor. It's important to keep in mind that not only are we dealing with this question, but for example, the second highest population of African descended people outside of the continent is in Brazil. And even though we have that large number of Afro-Brazilians, they're still dealing with a similar question as well. How do they reconcile their identity and their history with the forced labor and servitude that those individuals, forcibly provided that built the country and affected the politics of where it currently stands. So Pan-Africanism in that sense, reminding us of not, again, the rich history of the diaspora, but also pushing us to form coalitions based on this shared identity, not the exact identity, right, but the shared origin. Whether I can point to, the specific, um, current country or tribe in Africa that I come from, but the idea that there is that shared origin and the shared desire for liberation, particularly once we recognize white supremacy as a global construct. It's not something that's just occurring in the United States. So I think it's helpful in that way, but the particularity of, the oppression that's being experienced here also has to be accounted for as well.
Hello, my name's Erin. I'm also a student of Dr. Reed's class. First of all, I just want to say thank you for speaking. It's been so amazing to listen to what you've said. But my question is, what do you think we as college students can do to kind of reach that future that you're talking about? And also, how do we maintain hope when it feels like we're in a society where it's like 1 step forward, 10 steps back?
Well, I'll start with your last question. Part of the illusion of white supremacy, I firmly believe, is this idea that there is no hope. And I want to be clear that hope means different things to different people. So I'm a proud pessimist in many aspects of my life. As folks who know me know this. And that doesn't mean that I don't believe in hope. I think hope relies on the fact that we could stop what we're doing at any point in time and wake up to a completely different society. That possibility has not gone away. If we mean hope in the sense that we can return to some sort of original position, that's different, right? Especially when we consider things like climate change. Many of those effects are unfortunately irreversible, but we shouldn't stop that fact and that reality from pushing us to still work towards a better future. It can always get worse, but it can also always get better. And so when it comes to this question of what can you all as college students do, you can do a lot. The very history of Black radicalism in terms of, its origin in the academy, that came from students. That came from students who were willing to risk their academic standing and occupy buildings to force their administration to meet their demands of wanting to have a curriculum that was centered around their lived experiences and the experiences of those of African descent. So students have a lot of power, and it's really, again, an illusion of the administration to get you all to think that you don't. So I don't work at Butler, so obviously I want to put that on the line, right? These are my own thoughts. This isn't something that I've coordinated with Dr. Reed. So I don't want him to get an email where they're like, why'd you let this person come and tell the students to go occupy the building, right? But I mean, that's something that you can do. It's been done. And ultimately, again, think of the fact that your institution, my institution, would not be here if it weren't for you all. That's why I have a job, to teach you. That's the primary, reason why I have a job. That's what funds my research. That's what funds my ability to, even do some of my service activities. You all are paying to be here. And if, academics want to invest in this consumer-based model and you're not happy with the product that you're getting, vote with your feet. Money talks. And there are concessions that will happen if enough of you pull together and put those demands on the line. Certain things won't happen because, again, structurally, right, the institution is not going to be a liberatory place. But it doesn't mean that it has to only be a place of pain and suffering either. So things can give, and that's, what Lord means when she's talking about the master's tools. You just have to have a good idea of what house you're in first, and then go from there.
Hi, Dr. Thomas, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
My name is Lucy. I'm a student of Dr. Reed's. And I was interested in, so you mentioned like the manufacturing of fear. And I'm particularly interested in how we are seeing this in the media right now. And how it's like super prevalent in that a lot of this is targeted about media, it's targeted to media illiterate people. And so maybe it's not so much affecting academics, but these people who they see this once, twice on media and they're believing it. So these like pseudo cases that you mentioned, out one or two of those, and people will take that and run with it. And I'm interested in how we can combat that particularly. It's kind of hard to control those huge media sources right now.
This is a really important question, and I think this is really what is driving the desire of, conservatives, especially people like Elon Musk, to try and buy various social media platforms, even, trying as far as to buy OpenAI, which is the company that, generates ChatGPT. So, sorry, that's my dog Baldwin in the background. But so this question of, what do we do with misinformation is really important because unfortunately, many of the platforms where we could try and find reliable news, especially in a digital format, they're behind paywalls. It's also much more expensive to buy a newspaper nowadays. Cable is expensive, right? And many of the channels, that exist on this basic, non-Comcast or whatever it is version, they're not always reliable. And then we also have to consider the fact that many media channels are, have a particular subjective point of view, whether it's from a liberal or conservative perspective. So there's that issue. There's also the fact that social media never properly regulated the content that was posted on its platforms. Twitter tried to for a while. Of course, once Elon Musk bought Twitter, all of that was dismantled. Zuckerberg just announced that, right, the fact checkers on Facebook are being terminated and Facebook would no longer be concerned with fact checking. So that means the misinformation that already was getting through is now being multiplied in exponentially horrible formats. But I think one thing that's always going to be useful, and actually academics should be concerned with it because we do this too, even though we go through years of training to learn how to do research and to, ensure the validity of our citations. It's always helpful to critically analyze the sources where we're getting information from. So social media is helpful in spreading information because it can be done so quickly, and these platforms are free. The problem, of course, is that, we have to also take a certain level of responsibility, not just in what we're sharing, but also in what we're absorbing. So one of the ways to do that, I would say, is really to try and push the sources of news that you absorb. Also, look at non-American news sources as well, because they do tend to be more objective. But the concern about misinformation is really one that's never going to go away, and that's been a concern for centuries as well. There are various terms for this that I won't say because they're derogatory, that have been used historically, talking about different forms of journalism. But ultimately, this manufacturing of fear is dependent on misinformation. because the whole idea is to prevent us from seeing the connections and relations that we have with each other. And fear is a very powerful motivator, as well as shame and anger and all of these other affective states. And ultimately, what really drives the surge of misinformation and ignorance, I think, is based on, the connection to social capital that people have. So the more social capital, the more social credibility you have, the more likely people are to listen to whatever it is that you say, even if it's demonstrably false. And this is where we have this idea of fake news, right? Or alternative facts that while it might have come onto our consciousness in 2016 or whenever he said it, again, it's not something that's new. So this concern about information and the spread of information, whether it's valid or not, that's always going to be an active concern. And I think keeping that in mind and not only being conscious of it, during certain political events is really going to be key there.
Good afternoon, Dr. Thomas. My name is Jimmy. I'm also a student in Dr. Reed's class. So I was fascinated by your talking point about shifting the focus from what is Blackness and what is the Black problem and shifting it towards what is the white problem, what is whiteness. And I guess my question would be, how would you go about shifting that perspective and having that conversation? As I find in my life, it is constantly about a Black issue, but how does one go about talking about whiteness and how that impacts our history?
Really good question. And I'm going to say something that's probably controversial, but it's something I'm working through with my book manuscript right now. So maybe you all can help me with this. But I think we have to be honest that we're not going to save everybody. We're not going to reach everybody. Some people are very happy in their ignorance. They want to stay in that ignorance. And there's nothing that you can say or do that is going to change their mind. They really have to come to that realization on their own. And this isn't even just about racial issues. I mean, let's, even take anti-vaccine points of view as well. There's no study that you can show some of those people that's going to get them to change their mind about the misinformation that they've been absorbing. So again, I think there's the reality of that, and how do we balance that with this desire to still have radical change and to still impact the world in a positive way, and to get more people to, gain this critical consciousness that's necessary to reformulate that question, right? Is it a problem of Blackness or is it a problem of whiteness? And that, I think, is really tied to this question of, how is it that we can truly be radical? Because truly being radical means being intentional about why this is not an issue of Blackness, why this is not a problem for Black people, and also being honest about what really needs to be destroyed. So it means that we need to ask these people, right, whether they're strangers or family members, what is it that you're holding on to that you believe gives you more power than the actual truth? What is it that we're holding on to that serves power more than it serves justice? What systems are we maintaining because we're afraid of what comes next? Why is it that we're so insistent on this us versus them mentality when the reality is that the 1% don't like either of us? Why is it that we're so resistant to acknowledging the fact that the poor white man has more in common with the Black man than he does someone like Donald Trump or Elon Musk? And so I think what's hard there is it's not just about getting these individuals involved in protests, it's about vision. And it's really about getting them to see beyond what exists now and daring to create something new. And Baldwin I think he has a phrase where he says something like, any change implies the breakup of the world that we once knew. And that's why radical change is terrifying. That's why these conversations are terrifying. It's not just, when they happen at the Thanksgiving table. It's about what happens when we really force people to consider the fact that everything that they know is a lie. And it's a lie that they've been fed from birth that serves nothing other than to maintain this illusion of power. And this fear, whether it's manufactured or not, this fear is ultimately dictating our future. Not just my future as a Black American, but also the future of white Americans, right? The regular white folks who are so concerned with, ensuring that they get ahead, that they'll vote someone into office and support an administration that is doing more harm for working class and middle class white Americans than previously seen in history. Why is it that we see individuals in these communities continuously and historically vote against their self-interest? And it's because all of this is based on the manipulation of the fear that they have to continue to hold on to this vision of whiteness. So what I think there, the real question is, how can we move beyond, just having conversations and really be able to push people to dream for a radical future, not just for other communities, but also for themselves. So freeing white Americans of the Black problem is also freeing themselves. And this is why Baldwin says in The Fire Next Time that our futures are inexplicably linked together. And we won't be free until they're free. So if we want to be free, we have to help them. They're our long lost brothers. Whether we like it or not, it's a very hard demand, an ethical and moral demand. But if we want liberation, we have to do it.
So good. Opening up to the general floor, not just my students, and also I'm monitoring the chat if anybody who's watching online wants to submit a question. Anybody from the room?
Good afternoon. My name is Marwan. I am not one of Dr. Reed's students. My question would be, understanding, like the other day, I read Black and White Spaces by Anderson Elijah, and you say, or you're asking us to work with like white people and understanding like we can be free without them being free. But the notion of understanding like they believe white spaces are their inherent, I'd say territory. And understanding black spaces are places they don't have to be. Because as Black people, we can't function in American society or even in global society without moving through white spaces. But white people can just admonish our spaces and behave like they don't need to be there to progress. So my question for you would be like, how would you convince somebody who doesn't even truly believe your space exists and help them out?
So first I'll say the position of Black Americans having to help white Americans and this idea of our liberation being tied together, that's not my original belief. That's coming from Baldwin. Lord has a similar construct as well, and ultimately Du Bois does, and so does Morrison. One piece that might be really helpful for folks here to read by Morrison is I think it's 3 pages, but it's called Racism and Fascism. And this is where she literally details the step-by-step process of creating an other. And one of the ideas is, in fact, what you mentioned previously, this assumption that white people don't need to interact with Black folks, they don't need to go into Black spaces, et cetera, et cetera. This isn't something, again, that's unique, and part of what Malcolm X discusses in his his lectures, even after he was exiled from the Nation of Islam, is this idea of separation versus segregation. So the Nation of Islam, Black Israelites, and other Black communities have formed organizations where they've created their own banks, they have their own schools, they have their own grocery stores, in a desire to completely, you know, voluntarily, you know, separate or self-segregate from white America. And the difference there is, right, that's a personal choice. It's not something that's being put upon them. But I don't know that I'm really here to convince anybody. That's not my calling. I think that everyone, right, when we talk about these projects and we talk about radicality, everyone has a role, and we don't all have the same roles because we don't all have the same skills. I'll say right now, I don't have the patience for certain conversations. So, like, people in my life, they already know not to ask me certain things because I'm going to tell them the truth and they don't want to hear it, or they're not ready for how I'm going to say it. So honestly, I leave those questions to other people that are better at having those conversations. That, you know, it's not that I avoid it because they're hard. It's really, for me, it's mentally taxing to have circular argument with somebody, because at some point you realize you're not really trying to have a discussion, you're not trying to learn, or you're not even trying to consider a different position. You're steadfast in your belief, because if you were to consider even the possibility that you're wrong, it's going to destroy your whole worldview. So for many of these people, I mean, it's also hard for me too, because I'm not white. I've never been white. You know, I learn about whiteness and I observe whiteness, but, you know, I don't have the experience of having a worldview that is centered in a particular type of vulnerability that whiteness does. You know, there are similar observations folks makes with cisgender privilege, but I don't have that either. So for me, I would say, I mean, the way about convincing people, I don't even know if I want to convince people that it's the right thing. Some people, I think it's less about how do we make them more, you know, better people, or how do we convince them to, you know, recognize that every space is a Black space, whether they see us there or not. Hey, if you're using a traffic light, congratulations, Black invention. The folding chair, Black invention. You know, the blood bank, Black invention. So even if we're not in those spaces physically, we are still there. A lot of that, I think, is going to, again, depend on whether or not we can even get most of these individuals to get to the point of realizing that whether they like Black people or not, they do need us. And they continue to need us. And not just us, I mean, other non-white people. And we've seen this right now with the various the mass deportation efforts that are happening here, not quite as the same level as the previous administration. But now you have all these farmers saying, wow, I have no one to pick my food. And I don't understand why people don't want $12 a day to stand out in a field and work for no benefits. This idea that, you know, they had where they said we can only, you know, we can just have these people and keep them in subjugated positions and they don't really matter, they don't really serve us. Of course, that's false. And of course, it's wrong to think about the only utility of these individuals being in a position of service. But a lot of the fear now, too, even from those who are more pejorative in their thinking, they're realizing that the relationality, the closeness, the ties that they had with these people, it's much more prominent than they initially thought. So I don't think that those individuals, all of them at least, will get to a point where they change their beliefs and, you know, they're out marching with everybody. But I do think we can push them to still change their actions so that at least, you know, it still brings about that necessary change without having us to rely on changing their beliefs and then getting them to change their actions. There are ways that we can, persuade folks and get them to do certain things without, necessarily relying on changing their minds or having them become better people, whatever that might mean.
Good. We may have time for one more question. Anybody? Okay. Well, you can ask a second. Anybody else before I give it back to Jimmy? Okay.
Hi, Dr. Thomas, Jimmy again. So to kind of just, I guess with everything you've been saying, a question that stays in my mind is, what are we willing to sacrifice for that change? And this idea of two separate worlds being closer than we think, I think there's this level of accepting reality that both sides have to equally give up. Whatever it may be for that proper change. So I guess to kind of just be blunt, what do you feel like Black America should think about in terms of going about that change, and what white America should think about?
I mean, I don't know if I'd say that the sacrifices are going to be equal. I mean, the demand that Baldwin gives of us in his writing, not just in The Fire Next Time, but in many of his writings and his interviews when he's talking about the shared future that white and Black Americans have, and I would even expand that to say the shared future that white and non-white people have globally. That's something that is going to demand certain things of people that might be more risky. They might be harder to accept, again, because when you're already in the socially marginalized position, you're already sacrificing and giving up aspects of your life and your future if you continue to put stock into these structures. So I think really the best way to answer this question is where I ended, which is, what do we really want? Or what do we mean when we say we need something new or we need change? If we want to keep changing the system, I mean, we can do that. Again, I'm not knocking anyone who's, arguing for institutional change within these systems. I'm just saying that that's only a Band-Aid, and that Band-Aid has to be ripped off, the wound cleaned. Sometimes it means maybe we have to take care of an infection, so it's worse, right? We've taken some steps back, but it can still do something, but it's not actually going to fix the wound. So, when I say burn it down, and sometimes that scares people, that makes them think of riots and destruction and chaos, and that's not really what I mean. I'm not going to say that it's not a reality, because it's going to happen. Rioting is the voice of the oppressed. But I think we have to ask ourselves an honest question, everyone, when has this country ever been reformed without fire? The American Revolution, fire. Civil War, fire. Urban rebellions, in the 1960s, fire, literally and metaphorically. So there is going to be violence, and there is going to, be a requirement that we accept that power concedes nothing without demand. Frederick Douglass said this. Yet people only call it violence when we do it, even though there's a history of not only violence in this country, but political progress coming about through violence. So when I say burn it down, and I say, we really need to push ourselves to make demands of these dominant groups, and push ourselves to consider what we're willing to give up and what we need to give up, because they're not the same thing. We need to be willing to dismantle the myths of white supremacy. We need to be willing to disavow ourselves of the illusions of white supremacy and this desire that if we're close to white people, and I mean in the sense of, putting ourselves in some proximity to whiteness, that we'll get some sort of benefit. We need to dismiss and dismantle or disavow ourselves of this idea that we need to have permission to exist, and that we have to continue to always start within the system, and that working within this system is the only way to have change. And we also need to be willing to sacrifice the privileges and comforts that we have. Because that's what leads us to still maintain this sense of individualism and keeps us from actually pushing towards that radical future, which means we are going to have to make certain sacrifices if we want to have collective change.
Yeah. Can we give it up for Dr. Kay David Thomas? First off, I know we're down to like 30 seconds. Bailey, I'm just so thankful for you. You and I came out around the same time in this house called philosophy, where we were still less than 2% of the philosophers as Black philosophers. So I'm so thankful for you. Thank you for everyone who came, whether you came one session or all four. Thank you so much. The BCR code is up here for those who want to scan in with other students. Otherwise, thank you all from the depths of my heart. And we'll see what it is again next year.
Thanks, everyone.